South Australia's Entrepreneurial Ecosystems Voice of the Customer research report, and that's Allan and Gerard, Allan O'Connor and Gerard Reid. Gerard's got a Bachelor of Arts from the University of New South Wales, where he studied theatre, history, politics, film and religion. And he also has 2 master's degrees, a Master of Arts from the University of Arts in London, where he further developed his interest in the history and production of independent films and documentary, and a Master of Entrepreneurship from the ECIC, and he's just finishing his PhD in entrepreneurship and the film industry there. And Gerard, with his documentaries, he and his wife are co-founder of a digital and screen production company here in Adelaide. So Gerard's going to be saying a few words, and let me tell you a little bit about Allan O'Connor. Allan's our Postgraduate Academic Director for Innovation and Entrepreneurship here at the ECIC. Allan's is a fantastic guy, a great focus on research, but able to actually communicate from a teaching point of view as well. He's co-authored not only the book and the report we're talking about tonight. Allan's also co-authored the leading Asia-Pacific text on entrepreneurship, theory, process and practice, with 2 very distinguished professors, international professors, Professor Howard Frederick, who's now in Monterrey University there in Mexico, and Professor Donald Karatko from University of Indiana. So Allan's very active in what he does. I don't know how he finds the hours in the day, but he's also been involved in establishing here in Adelaide the Australian Cluster Observatory. And this has come from his connections and work with key people in Europe there. And so Allan's setting up not only an Australian cluster observatory, but one with an Asia-Pacific focus. And of course his last activity here that we're talking about tonight is his in-depth study of entrepreneurial ecosystems, which he's going to say a few words about. So over to Allan and Gerard.
Thank you for coming tonight for this release and launch. We're giving lots of stuff away tonight, obviously. So before I go into the report, I want to want to thank a couple of people. First of all, the work that we've been doing wouldn't have happened without the Department of State Development. So thank you, both Marilyn and Gavin, for all the support you've given us across the time. It's been wonderful to get the connections and always know there's a sounding board and someone to go and speak to when we're struggling at different points in time. So thank you very much for that. And there are the others who aren't here tonight, unfortunately. Tim and Philip, also from the department, have been excellent support. But more also, Mr. Paul Daly, the man who actually got our entrepreneurial ecosystem map up and running in the last 2 years. He's been a stalwart support for this as well. Sort of a backstop and always someone to go back to. But that has also been assisted by the Adelaide City Council. So thank you for the Adelaide City Council for backing this and actually making things happen. Gerard has been a stalwart behind this as well in terms of getting this done, getting everything organised to actually get this project delivered down to Gerard in many ways. Lastly, the research participants, you know who you are. You are all anonymous in the report, but we will be seeing some case studies coming from this work as well, so it'll make you a little bit more visible. But again, the insights come from our participants who actually contributed their time voluntarily to this project. Oh, sorry, one more thing. I didn't get it. I like doing that. One more thing. I just wanted to say something about the Integrating Innovation book, and thank you, Gerard, for co-editing with me. It's a great experience. But also thank you to all the contributing authors who were up here a while ago. Without them, that wouldn't have happened either. So we needed all of their inputs, and I'm holding my breath, thinking to myself, should I say something or not? But I reckon there's another book to come. So look out for that, and I will actually invite some more contributions in due course. That's if you're up for it. So let's look out for something else, and then let's see if we can actually leverage this into a report. So thank you all those people involved. Now, Gerard, I'd like to invite you just to come and say a little bit about the research background and get us moving on that.
the interesting thing about the research background was that it started with a comment, and it was Yana Matthews who asked Paul at an event, I think it was in Mega, and said, there's so much happening in Adelaide, how do you keep track of it? And Paul, that was in December 2012, and Paul then went away and thought about that, and thought, okay, well, I'll try and work something out, which he did, and it resulted in a meeting in early January, and given that it was the Christmas period, a number of people managed to get there, and enough to work out on post-it notes 4 categories, which you can see there. So yellow was educational, pink was network programs, blue was incubators, and green government support programs. So it started with 4, but it moved to others, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But so this was sort of like the very beginning of what became like a series of iterations. Now, the interesting thing, and as we progressed with our research on ecosystems, and I thought one of the very interesting thing about it is that the lack of a device is part of the ecosystem, because people are so involved in it that you don't necessarily have a consciousness of it. And so as we were progressing with the research, people had their own part of it, and that was a very interesting observation. So the Adelaide City Council came in support of the meeting that took place initially in Innovise, and then they put together in June 2013 a forum at the Convention Centre, which involved entrepreneurs from the ecosystem, which wasn't necessarily defined at that point. And then later in September was the public forum at the Adelaide Town Hall, and a number of people, as I understand, went to that. It was quite well attended. So that then led into, there was a very small grant that Allan managed to secure with regard to ecosystems, and that began the research. And that research then moved into what would become an examination of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and looked primarily at the map. And as you can see there are a number of categories. There's 8. And those 4 categories that were initially on those post-it notes became the 8 categories there. But it's interesting with regard to the map itself, it actually is in the form of post-it notes. Okay, so it kept its history, and it's integrated into it, and Paul regularly updates it. So that's what they became. So network and startup events, formal education, industry education, co-working spaces, incubators and accelerators, advisory services, government assistance and investors. And we looked at, in the initial stages of that momentum grant, that modest grant, looked at entrants, the oldest entrant and the oldest person in that category, and the youngest entrant, and interviewed those to then work out a series of questions that we'd later bring to the research into the ecosystem. So, interestingly, the research that we have conducted began in some ways with a former research project that was conducted through ECIC with Department of State Development, which was then DMITRA, looking at the Valley of Death. And so the Valley of Death, for people who are not familiar with it, is that juncture where you move from startup to survival, and then hopefully you're making it to growth, and then eventually exit. But in that survival stage, you're very vulnerable, and often you're completely unsupported. So government support, as you can see there, sort of falls away, and then there's that sort of gap when you have to become robust and exist in the market on your own, and then hopefully private equity will then pick it up and then take it through to exit. So we were looking at that. And with that, I'll hand over to Allan.
Thanks, Gerard. Research findings. So what did we actually find? Let's start with a little bit of demographics about who was involved as participants, to give you a sort of a sense of who we were covering. We had 43 participants. Average age of our participants were around 43.8, 44 years, somewhere around there. The age of the ventures that they were involved in is about 8 years. So these are not necessarily all new ventures. It was scattered across an array. To give you a sense of that, down here, the stage of the business, we had either pre-startup, the startup, whether it's the registration and trying to get sales, the survival mode, once you pass that, into growth, and you'll notice there were 20 of the firms we interviewed were in that growth stage. 3 were actually seeking exit, and three of them didn't give us a category. So you see most of them were actually in this growth stage. So what we're looking for is, what was your experience of Adelaide's entrepreneurial ecosystem as you progressed through these stages? Prior experience, many come from already private sector, some from government, a couple of students, and some were self-employed prior to their venture. We had a good gender and split between males and females, so there was a good representation there. Interestingly, education, 37 of our participants actually had university qualifications of some sort, whether that be degree or masters. 6 of them had vocational training to actually back this up. Now this is interesting for when you realise that the success of ventures often depends on how well you're educated to think about things in complex terms. Average years of work experience is 22 and a half, so they're not necessarily all young entrepreneurs that we've got here. And we actually had a category of youth and young entrepreneurs, which I'll talk a little bit about later. What else? And prior entrepreneurial experience, 17 said yes, and on average 6.5 years. So this wasn't their first venture necessarily. So that gives you a sense of who we interviewed. Profile of the business sectors. A lot of the business sectors were service sector biased. Education and training, business services, web or application development, social media, advertising, marketing, human resources, healthcare, property services or similar. Only 3 of the businesses may sort of exist in a more complex value chains, the sort of value chains that we were talking about earlier, that Gerard was referring to. Not at all a comment on the state of those businesses that we interviewed, but an interesting challenge that presents to us as an economic community is, how do we actually start to grow and foster firms that actually can support more complex or exist within more complex business environments. That's a key challenge for us. Interesting thing about one of our first questions was trying to understand the characteristics of entrepreneurs and their endeavours as perceived by our participants. Without doubt, it was kind of said, yes, it's a business founder, whether that be commercial or service or social oriented, didn't really matter, or could have been an entrepreneur, that came through. There was lots of attributes about the entrepreneur discussed. In essence, and in line with the academic literature, what you find is it's really difficult to characterise an entrepreneur through these attributes. So in the end, these attributes, yes, they're all quite relevant to the entrepreneur, but it makes it hard to actually, and difficult to find who the entrepreneur is. The thing that really is interesting is the opportunity itself. So when we start to look at who an entrepreneur is, it's the type of opportunity which is really distinguishing the entrepreneur. And in Adelaide here, we tended to find them more growth-oriented, but organically growth-oriented, and that kind of reflects on the fact that finance or seed finance funding, venture capital is a lot lighter here. So ventures tend to fall back on organic growth. Generating employment and contributing to social good were 2 things that they actually came through as a strong theme amongst the entrepreneurs we talked to. And lastly, there was a perception that the entrepreneurs should be looking at disruptive technologies and or business models. So it kind of gives you the sense of the type of entrepreneur that entrepreneurs are looking to identify with here.